Recording, going live in 5, 4, waiting for this bar to fill up. It's slowing down. Going live now.
Good
We're live.
morning. Good morning, Facebook family and friends. Welcome to season 2 of the Just Us Youth Talk Show. I'm so glad that you're here. I'm Carla Sutton McKinney, the Senior Associate Producer of the Just Us Talk Show. And now I'm going to turn it over to our show consultant.
Hi, good morning. I'm Karen Sutton, clinical social worker and a consultant for the show. I'm excited to be here today, and I'm going to pass it to Daria.
Hello, my name is Daria Gershfish, and I am an associate producer for the JustUs Youth Talk Show based in beautiful Chicago, Illinois. And for today, our episode is going to be focusing on mental health within the juvenile justice system. And our guest today is Dr. Ashlee Reed. Dr. Reed is an assistant professor and associate director of training in the clinical psychology department of Adler University in Chicago. She's worked in various capacities in forensic and clinical psychology throughout the Chicagoland area, including Cook County Jail, the Forensic Center, and Illinois Department of Corrections. In her career as a professor, she has taught various courses, including ethics, diversity, treatment of the juvenile offender, as well as forensic report writing and testifying. Her scholarly interests include community activism, the psychology of criminal behavior, issues within LGBTQ plus community, religious trauma, public policy, and psychodynamic theory and practice. If you have any questions, please feel free to call into the show at 563-999-3465 around 10:45 Central Standard Time. We'll be screening your calls and looking forward to hearing your questions. With that in mind, Dr. Reed, I want to turn it over to you and hear about your work and expertise in the field of forensic and clinical psychology.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Daria, and thank you for having me on Just Us Youth. Excited to be here. As Daria said, my degree and training are in clinical forensic psychology, focuses on where the legal system and then the study of human behavior intersect. In my career thus far, I've worked at Cook County Juvenile Probation. I worked at the Forensic Center doing fitness restoration services, fitness to stand trial evaluations, competency to stand trial evaluations, and worked with families for court-ordered evaluations as well in an outpatient setting. And then I worked with an adult men's prison with Illinois Department of Corrections for Juliet Treatment Center, which houses adult males who have a mental illness as well. Then in my capacity as teaching, I've been teaching a little bit of treatment of the juvenile offender, some forensic classes, and then I'm currently at Adler University.
Wow, that is so wonderful. What inspired you to work within forensic psychology?
I think curiosity first. I had a real curiosity with about people and what informs criminal behavior and what explanations there were for violent and nonviolent crimes, which led me to my graduate program where I was exposed to professionals in the field who were doing the work in Chicagoland. And my idea of what was responsible sort of shifted to more of a systemic lens and systemic inequities. And so that sort of drove my passion and governed some of my practicum experiences and the things that I sought out after getting my doctoral degree.
Wonderful. And how do you think the role of a clinical psychologist contributes to support people within this system?
I see it in a couple different ways. One of which is to educate, right? I think that it needs to be a lot of education at each level in the system, but also just to the layperson, right? Someone who maybe doesn't understand the systemic inequities that are involved at sort of every juncture of our legal system. And also, if we can, right, in my capacity as Cook County Juvenile Probation, I was there as a neuropsychological evaluation, someone who was conducting those. And I had to have sort of a stance of neutrality and couldn't be in an advocacy role. But if possible, right, when you are in a different role, it's not a court-ordered, I really think it's education and advocacy. And that's something that I've I've done throughout my career and hope to continue to do in a larger way as well. To talk to probation officers, to explain some of these things, to work with them in understanding mental illness, complex trauma, different things that can also help as well. And you're also educating judges, right, along the way, and maybe helping in terms of treatment recommendations and sentencing through that education as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know that you mentioned that you couldn't be in an advocacy role when doing psychological assessments, but I wanted to know if you could talk a little bit more about the process of psychological assessments and how it affects treatment and court proceedings.
Of course. So typically when I was working for Cook County, I would get a referral. This would typically be from a probation officer. So they identified a youth or a juvenile who might benefit, or whether they needed diagnostic clarification, they needed maybe some understanding about treatment recommendations, or anything that may help just for pre-adjudicated juveniles who are pre-sentence. So I would then conduct a interview with the youth. They would come in, right? They were on most of them, right, were out on probation, so they would come in for the interview. Though some I did interview in the detention center as well. I would do collateral with the educators, caregivers, right? Anyone I could talk to sort of get a holistic sense. And then would compile that and do some testing, whether that's IQ testing, a PAI or MMPAI, which looks at personality and gets at additional data points for diagnosis, and then pulling together some treatment recommendations. You're compiling that into like a 15-page report. And what I would find when I would go to the court then with the juvenile or the young person is the judge will just flip to the back, right? They're just flipping to the 15th page where you say, here's the diagnosis, here's the treatment recommendations. They're really not even sometimes looking at your conceptualization, right? Maybe you've spent painstaking time on, but I think spending time with the judges, if possible, being able to explain, right? I had a judge who like kind of flip through it and then sort of threw it on the desk and was like, I don't know what any of this means, right? And I was able to explain, okay, so let me break this down. Here's what this means. And in terms of treatment recommendations, this is why it's important. And this is why all of this information on these other pages are important, but let me break it down just in a paragraph of what we need to do and what would be most helpful for this individual. And so it was used sometimes in treatment recommendations and also when it comes to the least restrictive alternative. So I would also be doing risk assessments for juveniles. We would use the SAVRI, which is a structured professional judgment development tool. And so again, it would look like a similar process. We would be interviewing the youth, we would be interviewing family, we would get a sense of, typically this is when there was a past violent offense, and we would sort of, impossible to know for sure. We know that we can't predict violence, but to look at the data, look at the support systems involved, look at some measure of saying whether or not there was a low, moderate, high risk of future offending when it comes to a violent crime. And even though there was a sense of neutrality, I think you could sort of advocate through your writing, right, with what you know about complex trauma, what you know about what the literature says, right, about I'll drive this into the ground when we talk about juveniles, but frontal lobe development, and that it is not developed until 25 or longer there, keep raising it, mid-20s. And so what that means for decision making and impulse control and how we can't sort of hold youths to the same metric as we do, right? So we have juvenile courts and we don't have adult courts, and I'm going to go off on a tangent with that. But so I think really using it at, your forensic report writing can be an advocacy in some ways, even though you are staying neutral in terms of you're reporting the facts, right? It is factual that the frontal lobe doesn't develop to this time. It is factual that inequality and complex trauma and all these various things factor into why maybe a juvenile is involved in the system, and what might be beneficial is going to look different, and what I might recommend is going to be different, knowing and having that background.
Absolutely. And, one thing I remember us talking about is like treatment accessibility and how difficult that is to get like the right support for juveniles. Can you talk about your experiences with that and how it may have impacted your recommendations?
Yeah, this is difficult. Because if it was beneficial, I'm still going to recommend it. But I remember being so disheartened by some of the, maybe you're recommending individual therapy, but there being barriers to that. You're recommending programs. You're looking at perhaps what there are in terms of supports out there. And I would work, probation officers, actually, some of them had a lot of knowledge that was helpful in terms of what are you linking families to? What are you linking that maybe is low cost, no cost, or is accessible in their neighborhood, right? I'm not causing, I'm not giving a suggestion that is not going to be accessible or available. I think one of the things too was looking at it from more of a holistic lens, with regard to it maybe not even being a therapeutic intervention, right? Like prosocial behaviors for someone who is struggling with a lot of volatility at home and who has maybe acted out and had acting out behaviors. Maybe it's a prosocial behavior like getting involved in Ask boxing program, but like thinking outside of the box in conjunction with these other things. I find that it's difficult, but really keeping a resource. I had a resource list at the time that I was like forever adding to when I would find some programs, especially in Chicagoland and sort of across Chicagoland, that might be useful to sort of plug into those treatment recommendations. But I think that was difficult, and you never know, right, what's going to be put in like conditions of parole, right? Sometimes it would be court mandated then that they go to some level of individual psychotherapy, et cetera. But of course, sometimes the judge can disregard, of course, the treatment recommendations as well.
Hi, Carly, you have a question?
Well, yes, Dr. Reed, going back to something you said in your earlier response about the frontal lobe and the development of our young people, as we look at, we've always had juvenile defenders. It seems that there's an increase in that, especially with violent crimes. It seems that our it's getting younger and younger. And I'm thinking about, we're talking about mental health, and having been a teacher in an alternative school system, I got a chance to see, and I think about one such case in particular, or two, where the young people had been in a juvenile system. So they went from 7th grade to a 9th grade environment with individuals who had this matriculation, had been able to grow with their peers, and how when they were put into this environment, how just everything about them was different. Their social interactions, their ability to respond. I'm asking a question with respect to the growing population of younger violent offenders and their mental health. How does the environment that they're growing up in, how does that play into the choices that they're making dealing with conflict?
Yeah, I think first of all, I think across the board, we're dealing with a mental health crisis in this country. It was all the more worsened by COVID, the pandemic, and the isolation and the difference in education and disruption to education as well. But in terms of what could be going on, as you were talking, I was thinking about a particular case as well, where figure out how to word it. There were some mitigating factors in their home environment, right? And they were put on house arrest, right? So they were on ankle monitoring, and they kept breaking that. And the probation officer, they kept violating it, et cetera. But I had to go in and sort of from that have a meeting with a probation officer to say, okay, this may not work for this individual because they have domestic violence in the home, right? This is happening at the home. This is going to lead to them being out, being back on the street, doing these things because they're not safe in their current environment. And I know it's more of a broad question. It could be many things, but I think there is a sense of belonging often found in gangs. We can talk about that. There's a sense of safety and community found in gang membership for young people, especially in Chicagoland. There are, of course, poverty really creates that. What we know, right, what really reduces crime is income equality and education, investing in schools and public schools, and really investing in infrastructure is what is really going to reduce that crime. And so I see the income disparity, the racial inequality as being responsible and some of these things going on for this influx in crime that you're speaking about.
Dr. Reed, with all of that in mind, a clinical psychologist not only is able to do assessments, but they also do therapy. I wanted to know if you could talk a little bit about your approach to therapy and how it impacts your work with youth.
Yeah, I think initially, and I still am a psychodynamic therapist primarily, really interested in early childhood experiences. So that does shape my work with youth, right? The work of Nadine Burke-Harris, right, where we look at adverse childhood experiences. Love Nadine Burke-Harris. Pivotal research that has really shaped how we look at youth and development, and also complex trauma, and how our notions of PTSD are outdated because that is for an event that was traumatic that happened in the past, and these traumas are ongoing with juveniles, right? And so my theoretical orientation is largely psychodynamic, and it's what I use maybe in a TLDP format, in a time-limited dynamic psychotherapy format in the prison when I was doing more trauma therapy with adult prisoners. But I also, in recent years, have changed more of like a systems lens as well. I bring systems into that because of my like growing understanding of systemic inequality, and also a little bit of feminist theory as well, right? Who has power, who doesn't, and how can we work to empower those who feel that they don't have that power in society?
Wonderful. I love it. So important. You mentioned complex trauma. That is, of course, so important in thinking about how we work with clients. For our viewers who may not know what complex trauma is, could you give like a definition?
Yeah, absolutely. So it is similar and in some ways to post-traumatic stress disorder, but it has some key differences. And I do want to say that this is not recognized currently in our diagnostic statistical manual in the DSM, though I hope, and it has come before the committee, I think a few times, and I hope that it is included in the future. So it's not a recognized diagnosis in the DSM. However, it's quite part of like the community. Everyone sort of understands in the field that this is a very real disorder. So complex trauma is one that is many threats of either threatened or actual violence, or something that has occurred that has caused trauma, right? Which what we know about trauma is that it can lead to what we think of PTSD. We think of combat veterans. It can lead to flashbacks, nightmares. It can lead to, in young people, it often looks a lot maybe like ADHD, right? It can be very inattentive. There's a lot of overlap and misdiagnosis actually of ADHD when perhaps we need to look at these inattentional processes with regard to complex trauma. And the difference with complex trauma versus PTSD is complex trauma, the trauma is ongoing. It's not for events that have happened in the past. These are things that are ongoing. So is it the trauma of being involved in a broken system? Is it the trauma of being involved in a society that maybe doesn't value you, right? Here we are. Is it the trauma of being involved, right? These are all these things, but of housing insecurity, right? Food scarcity, not knowing where your next meal will come from, domestic violence in the home, perhaps familial legal involvement where they're not able to be in the home with you, right? All these traumas. And then we get into maybe being a victim of a violent crime, having a peer lose their life to violent crime. Like these things are compacting and ongoing, and it's not one singular event, but more all of it kind of coming together and culminating in just ongoing series of trauma. And how we look at complex trauma, especially when it comes to juveniles, right? Juveniles don't have a lot of agency in changing sometimes that environment. And so how we treat complex trauma in juveniles has to be through that lens of there's so much about it that they don't have control over, right? In terms of agency. So how we look at it and how we treat it has to be from a trauma-informed lens, and it has to come from an understanding of these larger systemic issues.
Thank you so much. Karen. Oh, you're on mute.
So sorry about that, but Dr. Reed, when you mentioned Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, I thought I was going to jump out of my chair. This is my thing. Complex trauma is my thing. Even before that, you mentioned mitigating circumstances that people often don't want to give consideration to. And then you just hit on the fact that youth have very little, if any, agency. So all of that brought to mind for me, how do you manage these things? Because they feel like barriers. And how do you, I don't know, not necessarily say remain encouraged or focused, but in light of all of these profound barriers that you have when you have to try to present these things to people who may not be receptive, how do you manage that? And how does that impact your work overall in the forensic psychology field? Because those things are important, but as you said, they're not well embraced and received and are very readily dismissed, but they explain so much.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Thank you for that question. It is difficult. I think there was a lot of education too with probation officers around this because they were sort of who I was interacting with more frequently. But it can be really overwhelming and disheartening in the work, right, with young people. But I don't think it's hopeless. I had a supervisor initially at Cook County Juvenile Probation sort of early on in my treatment, and what they said was truthful. It wasn't they were someone who had been involved in the juvenile system for quite some time. But I remember being really disheartened by this case that I had. And he was like, Ashlee, you have to remember, right? Like we are on the shore and all of these systemic issues are sort of in the ocean, right? All these different things that are going on. And the ocean's coming up to meet us very briefly, and then it's going back into that ocean. And I remember feeling so upset by that and wanting to fight against that notion. But there was actually a larger message in that of we do get to interact briefly, right? And we may not be able to change this right now in that interaction, but they're going back into that community with education, with knowledge. Maybe they're taking something with them as well. And it also factored into just my role in advocacy and maybe looking at it from outside the system, which is where I currently am now, sort of outside that juvenile justice system of how do we look at reform? How do we look at how we embrace recidivism and rehabilitation in a way that we're able maybe to mitigate that impact that comes from so many different places that is hard to influence, especially depending on your role sort of within that system. And my role as a evaluator was pretty brief working with juveniles as well. I also worked at the evening reporting center doing some anger management therapy, and with that kind of understanding, it's I think from in the evening there's a van that goes around and for those that are on ankle monitoring, and they bring them to this facility that's not in a corrections facility. I think we met in sort of a hall of some sort in their community in Inglewood, and we did anger management. We made it fun. We did hip hop lyrics. And that I really enjoyed because I wasn't at the courthouse. I wasn't at the juvenile detention center. And I was able, still, an extension of the system, but I think the ways in which I was able to interact with the youth had a different different feeling to it as well. And I really enjoy just that interaction. Yeah, okay.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to just add that that analogy was wonderful in terms of the shore and the sea. And it really made me think about the fact that with advocacy, we have to find a way to be impactful with that brief encounter. So we know we'll get it again, but we have to be prepared, like, okay, we're going to get this brief encounter. How can I be most impactful? That sort of keeps us encouraged. So thank you so much for sharing that. And I will back away and give it back to Daria.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all so much. One thing that I think it's important to consider when working with clients therapeutically is the therapeutic relationship, which for listeners, that can be understood as the relationship that you have with your therapist. And the stronger therapeutic relationship you have, the more success that you'll have, like in achieving your therapy goals, essentially. So I wanted to know if you could talk about the challenges of establishing that strong therapeutic relationship when you're coming from a position of power and privilege, like within the system.
Yeah, thank you so much. I don't know that I have all the answers to this one. I think I'm still trying to figure it out a little bit myself, but I think what was important for me to learn was that I needed to change how I looked at resistance. Resistance should be expected, right? I'm coming as an extension of the system. I'm coming as a visible white woman, right? As an extension of the system, working with someone and asking quite personal questions, right? In our clinical interview, our first meeting, I always explain, right? I have to ask pretty personal questions, right? What do they do for fun? What is their home life like? What are their relationships with their caregivers, right? I'm asking all of these questions to get at an understanding to help for treatment and for an overall understanding of them as a whole person. But I can understand that can feel quite intrusive. And I think my understanding of resistance needed to change initially. I think I was just like, okay, this is, if you're refusing to answer, if you're refusing to participate, right? Like I still have to say something to the judge, right? And so in the back of my mind thinking, oh, this isn't going to be good. But I think I started calling it out a little bit more. And I think that was really perceived as genuine with some of the juveniles that I worked with, some of the youths, right? Where I would say, I know you don't want to talk to me. Who am I, right? You're just meeting me. These questions are probably really nosy to you, right? Or whatever it is. And I wouldn't want to talk to someone I didn't know either about these things, right? All I can tell you are the choices that you have. I try to create agency because I'm keeping that in mind. So I would always break it down, especially I remember there was a youth who would answer every question with none of your damn business, right? That would just be every question, right? It'd be like, what's your date of birth, right? Just even little things. And I was really taken aback, like, okay, how do we do this? And I finally just put away the report, the notes I was making, and I said, look, let's not waste each other's time. I get it, right? You don't want to be here. I'm coming for this report that is going to go to the judge, but I am coming just to understand you better, right? And I understand if you don't want to participate, so I'm just going to give you the choices, right? So you have a choice whether to leave and to not participate. That is your choice, right? You have a choice to stay and kind of continue how we've been, where you don't really give me any answers and you keep repeating the same response, right? That's your choice too. You could do that too. Or third, we can just get through this as quickly as possible. And my goal is to make it as painless as possible, right? And hopefully it won't be as bad as you think kind of coming into it, but that's your choice. And then if you choose the first two options where you don't participate or don't participate in a meaningful way, I can't tell you what's going to happen. I don't know that. I'm not a fortune teller in that way, right? But I can let you know that I have to let the judge know that I met with you on this in the state. And I was not able to complete the report or do the report. And I don't know what they'll make of that information, but I respect you and your ability to make a choice that feels best for you. And I think that was really helpful, just like in breaking it down that way. Because there is, like I said, and I feel like a broken record, but there is not enough agency. And if I can create choice and create agency in a situation that already feels like there's some coercion involved, because they do know that there is like a threat of harsher sentence or some kind of negative consequence if they don't participate, I want to create that.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your honesty and transparency around that. That is so important to give patients, like clients, like choices and power in those situations, like across all settings, but particularly within the juvenile justice system, of course. One thing that you had mentioned that I just loved that you did some research within about the inequalities within the juvenile system and then went on to educate probation officers. Can you talk more about that, how that happened and what that experience was like for you?
Yeah, thank you. This was something I had an opportunity to do when I was an extern. So I, myself and another extern, just in our communications with probation officers as part of a class in my graduate training, we were going to Cook County in a different role at that time, but we were going to speak with them about their experiences. And I was learning that something I didn't know was that a lot of probation officers don't have mental health backgrounds. And a few of the people that we met with came from a sales background, right? Maybe they had a 2-year, 4-year, but they had been working at places like Verizon or like in a sales environment before coming, right? And they get training like on the job, but they're missing these foundational understandings of mental health, but also the system. And a lot of things that we've been talking about, but how, in fact, racism is quite heavily involved within the system. And so it was leading us to have some conversations around like, what could we do? So for our project in that class, we put together a presentation that we wanted to present to probation officers in small meetings throughout a month, where we would meet with them in groups of 6 or 7 and put on this, where we show at every juncture of the legal system, from arrest to whether they're housed with adults in the jail to whether they had accessible counsel, to support systems, to sentencing, to punishment, and what that looked like for Black and brown individuals versus their white counterparts, specifically in Cook County. And we use their metrics and data that are posted to be able to pull that. And we presented that, and we talked about some of the things that we knew in conjunction with that. And we had a dialogue with probation officers around what their reactions were to this information, what were their anecdotal experiences of this. And we open it up as well for them to ask questions and maybe to disagree, and maybe hopefully be a little closer to what we were recommending in terms of what they could do. They're on the front line of this when it comes to working with juveniles. They work with the families, they go in the home sometimes, right? They are heavily involved with the juvenile. And I thought it was really important for them not only to have a better understanding of mental illness, but the racial disparities and the biases that were impacted at every juncture of the legal system, that were involved in the demographics of who were even housing at the detention center being so disproportionate to who's committing the crimes versus who's being housed, and who is receiving harsher punishments as well.
What were like the themes, or maybe like how is it received? How, any resistance that you noticed in particular?
Yeah, I think largely there was some curiosity, right? There was some good dialogue. There was some pushback, I think. Perhaps they thought we were a bit naive, right? Coming in to the system. They've been in, for 20 some years, and here we are coming as part of our project and having these ideas of ways that we can change things. And I think there's always going to be pushback when you try to progress things further, or you try to challenge maybe the status quo or the ways that things are done. Largely, I think that there was an openness and a willingness to look at that, and some questions, some really thoughtful questions around what can we do in our role that may mitigate this bias, right? And so certainly they're overworked and they have a lot of work that they do, and I admire the work that they do, but I was hopeful from that project and from going around, at least this was back in, let's say, 2015 with Cook County Juveniles. So I'm hopeful that maybe that left an impact. It's sort of how I think about working with juveniles, right? We never know, like, down the road, right? If something doesn't click initially, or it doesn't feel like they're ready to process through it initially, maybe somewhere down the line or in a couple of years, you never know, like, what impact or something that you implant will be remembered, or maybe connect with something else as well.
I love that. Karen?
Yeah, and Dr. Reed, I just wanted to somewhat really just make a comment. I love that you said mitigating the bias with the education, but also you hit on something that is always, I shouldn't necessarily use the word bothered. It's not necessarily strong clinical terminology, but as someone who works with youth, you hit the nail on the head when you talk about the fact that there are a lot of people in this field without the educational background. Like, there's a lot of de facto default falling into working with children. And I think that often plagues a lot of how children are engaged in the work that's done with them, because you do have people with a sales background. You have people who come in with a journalism background. I have someone comes in and they've done absolutely nothing that contributes to child welfare. And so on a policy level, that really makes me just think about, why are we just so comfortable or okay with having people that are not appropriately educated and or committed to children working in this area? So it makes me think about, okay, what do we need to do to address that? So the work that you did to point out, to educate the probation officers, that excited me, because I feel like that needs to be done on an ongoing basis, because often in terms of being a juvenile probation officer, that is a bachelor's level degree, and that is still excellent. But they take people from so many different fields that you've got people across the board that have studied something completely different and have just fallen into this role. Again, it's not a specific question, but I'm glad you hit on that, because that work you did is essential. I hope someone picked it up after you and is carrying that torch, because it's necessary. There are a lot of people without the education and training that are working with this population, and it just doesn't serve children well.
Absolutely. Thank you, Karen. And I hope someone is continuing that work. And I really believe, they receive on-job training, but I think it really does need to come from mental health professionals. And that pulls on another thing itself, right? Pulling people in that can speak to that, rather than, I'm not sure what goes into their onboarding. I don't want to, I'll stay in my lane, but I do think, right, mental health workers do need to be involved in that education and in that process, because of those things that you're sharing as well.
Thank you. Quickly, I just want to make an announcement of the call-in ability for any of our viewers. Please feel free to call in at 563-999-3465 until 10:45. We will be taking your questions. But, I wanted to talk overall, just like any major lessons or realizations that have been particularly impactful for your understanding of the system's flaws and like working with clients and future changes that you feel like need to happen.
Yeah, I think in terms of understanding it for myself, like I said, it's an ongoing process for me. I've not arrived, but I think what really fostered my own understanding outside of just my own experiences of the system's failures, I think being an avid reader as well, I think works that have shaped my knowledge. I really love Audre Lorde and that understanding of intersectionality. Also reading The New Jim Crow in graduate school, right? I was exposed to that work, and that really just changed how I felt about the justice system in general, but it was something that I hadn't had previous exposure. And then recently, I really love Eve Ewing and her activism in the city of Chicago, as well as her work. She wrote a book about, it's called Ghost in the Schoolyard, and it was about Chicago school closures on the South Side and the ways that the community really rallied together. But just the impact of that, those closures as well in a community in Bronzeville. So I think reading and being aware really shaped my understanding, as well as I think my understanding of history. Understanding the racist history of this country, I think, is foundational to sort of my ongoing knowledge of just how policing, you know, how policing started, how this punitive system started. Having that understanding and continuing, you know, reading things like Angela Davis and abolitionism, and I really, I'm really interested in talking about prison reform and things like that. But I think really education, and I guess education, I think, is gonna for the future, I think, is really important as well. Just education of self, education of others, and what I envision going forward. Oh, such a hard, deep, and complex question, and a good one. I think, you know, more broadly, I can speak to, I think locally in our community, we've had a recent mayor shift who perhaps has a better understanding of systemic issues, Mayor Brandon Johnson. And I've been following the implementation of taking police out of our schools, which really contribute to the school to prison pipeline. And so there's some movement there, which makes me really hopeful, because we found, you know, having police in schools does not create increased safety. In fact, it creates undue harm. And so I find that really helpful, looking at the local level as well. And in terms of what I hope for, I want us to return to more of a rehabilitation look at juvenile justice. When we think about you still receiving life without the possibility of parole, I want to see changes made to those policies. You know, when we say to a juvenile, right, a 16, 17-year-old due to a violent crime, and we sentence them as a society, as a community, right, to life without parole, we're saying to them, we don't see any chance of change, and we don't see any value. Exactly. And that's false, right? Because that's not what we know from biology and science, right? Their brains are changing, right? There is great deal for change. There's great deal to rehabilitate, and we've seen it, and it's possible. I don't want to be judged by the worst thing I've ever done, right? And so I think we need to look at the fact that juveniles, there's a reason there was a different juvenile court. There's a reason that we started this work of looking at juveniles differently, and it's gone through some different phases, but it's not the same, right? There is a capacity for change and rehabilitation for adults too, and that's a whole other story, but specifically for juveniles as well. And the other thing I would like to see, as I was thinking about coming here today, is more restorative justice programs. Restorative justice, get the community involved, put it back in the hands of a community. Restorative justice is so important, and it also sends a message to the victims, right? That what matters, what happened to you is important to us, right? And getting that closure, or whatever you feel is important for you to move forward from this, often, you know, a violent crime. And it also sends a message to the perpetrator, right? That we don't think there's something irredeemable here, right? We are treating you as a human being, right? Who made this mistake or this error, and who we believe is possible of correcting. And so maybe restorative justice, more of those programs, lots of things, income equality, right? Changing the system. I mean, there's so many, but I guess maybe those would be the three that I would pinpoint. You know, getting police out of schools, focusing on rehabilitation, getting life without parole, these adult transfers, which is so devastating. I remember when I worked at Cook County, we were able to go to the juvenile detention center and just see the work that they were doing. And there was an art center where community members could come in and do poetry readings, and there was an adult transfer art project that they did every year for these juveniles that were currently being housed in the juvenile detention center, that when they reached the age of adulthood would then be transferred to an adult prison, and reading their poetry and their insights, and a lot of times remorse, and they're coming to terms with the fact that they would spend the majority of their lives behind bars. It's just truly devastating. I think it's so normalized in our society, but for us to really think, right, this is someone at 14, 15, 16 made this choice or this decision or had this level of circumstances that have happened, and now will never be outside in the community ever again, right? It truly is devastating, and I think that really opened my eyes as well to the need for that to be looked at in terms of parole as well.
Thank you so much. And I love that you mentioned restorative justice. Like, I also look forward to that, and I hope that that transition really does happen. For our listeners, like, can you talk about what restorative justice may look like from a clinical psychologist perspective or therapeutic lens?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of good people out there doing the work already, but it can, it depends. It's largely victim led, right? So they can choose whether or not they want to meet, right, with a perpetrator. Sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't. But what that looks like is, I look at it like, if you're thinking about going to court, it's almost like the mediation process before you go to court in some ways, right? And some courts have this restorative justice sort of within it, right? Where you can find a way to sort of correct it, or to express remorse, or find some healing within a community atmosphere. You have restorative justice workers who are trained in it. You have clinical psychologists, mental health workers who are sort of facilitating that conversation. You're taking, the judge, the lawyers sort of out of it, right? You're taking the legal aspect out of it, and the human aspect is more important, right? The saying, like, what happened to you, it says to the victim, what happened to you is wrong. And as a society and community, we want to restore wholeness, right? Or what we can do to restore wholeness. And for the victim, what can we do then to correct and make steps to get you rehabilitated going forward? And that's sort of in general. There's many different programs and ways to do it, but there was a great documentary I was just looking at today that Van Jones did. I think it's on HBO, that you can look at maybe how it looks in actuality. They agreed to be filmed, which is really, really wonderful, and something that you don't often see. So to sort of see that process as well.
Thank you so much. And looks like Carla had a question, but how do you think restorative justice programs assist in mental health well-being?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Yes, of course. How do you believe restorative justice programs assist in mental health well-beings?
I think, again, it creates a voice and agency, right? Again, it says, I trust that you know and can reflect and think through what has occurred, and that you can make it right in some way, or you can express that in some way. I'm trying to couch my language in some ways, depending on what the violent crime is. I'm thinking through all these things. There's no way to sort of reverse certain things, right? When we're talking about homicide, we're talking about a loss of a loved one, or some violent crime that maybe has left irreparable damage, et cetera. There's no way to fully restore that when we look at restorative justice. However, the goal of it, right, is to provide voice to both parties, right? I'm sorry, the sun is coming in, but to really provide an opportunity for the community as well to heal, and communities are involved in it. And I like the idea of taking it outside of more of a legal realm and putting it more into a human realm. I was looking at, I went to a virtual talk, a lot of them are virtual these days, but a virtual talk with Judith Herman, who wrote Trauma and Recovery I don't even know how many years ago, but has created and written another book sort of about what she has learned in her work in the interim. And so much of it is more on like taking it from a legal realm and putting it in the hands of community and the power in that for survivors as well, whether it be sexual violence or something, how impactful that can be for survivors as well. For it to be taken out of a legal context that often doesn't bring justice, right? Or doesn't feel they're not getting, right, that human aspect of it. And so really taking it into a community level, I find her work really helpful in that as well, and just shaping attitudes.
Thank you so much. Yes, that book is incredible. She talks a lot about restorative justice in that practice, or in that book. We have one question from the chat, wanting to know about how you incorporate real world experiences in the classroom, and particularly training future clinicians.
Oh, that's such a good question. I find this so invaluable because I learned as a student this way best, right? When I'm reading from a book and when I'm, getting a PowerPoint about the book, right? I'm learning, I'm being educated, but I find when a professor is able to share their own like lived experiences of the thing, whatever that thing is, I'm experiencing it, right? I'm learning it in a different way. I'm applying it in a context that is so important. And that's what I attempt to bring as a professor, right? Is bringing some of these examples, pairing it with some of the things that we're learning in our textbooks and through research articles, and to say this is what it looks like. And sometimes it's really complex. And then what do we do, right? Sometimes I'll make little vignettes. They're sort of a compilation of maybe a few different cases and provide them to students and like, let's work through this. How would we approach this from an ethical lens? How would we approach this from a systems lens? What are some resources that are available? Let's get on our computers and look at what resources are available in the city that we might link this person and their family to. Just getting them thinking about being a clinician. It's something that I wish I had more of, right? But I always like grabbed onto those experiences as a student, right? Where I could really take what I was learning and use it outside of the classroom.
Love that. I wanted to know what message or advice would you like to share with individuals or organizations interested in improving the psychological well-being of youth involved in the justice system?
Yeah, I keep going back to the idea, and if I can imprint anything, it would just be the idea that juveniles don't have a lot of agency when it comes to their home environment, the neighborhoods in which they live, the makeup of their family dynamic, potentially familial involvement with the law, and also this biological piece with the frontal lobes and impulse control and decision making and what we know about peer influence at that age and how it is often so much more of an influence than parents and caregivers, and everything that we know in terms of research all backs up and supports, right, the need for us to continue to educate about this, right, to continue to educate and advocate at the policy level, at the reform level, the ways in which we treat offenders who are released and how we acclimate and rehabilitate them back into our communities, just all the way through. And then the overarching thing that I would hope organizations or individuals interested in improving the psychological well-being of youth would just be to address systemic inequality, right, in our neighborhoods. And we can do that. Often there is this sense of powerlessness, right? We're just a group of people, we're just one person, but we can impact with our votes, voting in our local elections, looking at judges that maybe seem progressive, or looking at people that seem progressive, but looking at their voting history, right? What have they actually voted? And despite what they're running on, like what is the history of their voting? Really educating ourselves and then using that education to change our local community. I think that's really important, and can help address root causes of inequality, which we know contribute to crime. If we want to reduce crime, we need to reduce inequality. We need to stop racist policing. We need to increase education. We need to increase mental health access. There's a lot of things that we know work, but we know, and what we do in this country is the tertiary prevention, right? Like
Yes.
Fact. We incarcerate more than any other country, right? And it doesn't work, and we know it doesn't work, and we've seen research that it doesn't work, and these for-profit prisons and all of this factoring in. And so I think that's a big one that I know is a hard task, but that one as well. I think getting involved in any kind of advocacy that pushes the needle, and not letting the hopelessness of these different issues stop us from action. And then for families and youth involved in the system, just getting involved with resources and avenues for support. I think it can be such an overwhelming process, and using your community resources, using what's available to you to get involved, to help you work through this really overwhelming process, if possible. Trying not to do it alone, right? To really get involved with agencies that can put you in touch with lawyers or people to support you, or let you know about different programs that may be helpful as you navigate this really overwhelming and at times very unfair process.
Thank you so much. Something that I am curious about in the work of social justice is, how do you continue to find like hope and resilience in face of, feelings of powerlessness, helplessness, working with clients that lack agency? What advice do you have for people aspiring to make change off of that?
I think when there have been times that I've been really disheartened or maybe really impacted personally by a case or a particular issue, or maybe just in general with the work, I sort of take a step back and look at what's coming up for me, what's happening, what's feeding into this. And I always find there's always that like why. It's always there, right? I'm like, what is my why, right? Finding that. And looking at different experiences that I've had, where I have been able to make a difference, right? Even however small, right? Where I felt like I was able to intervene in a situation, I think really keeps me going. Because if we look at, right, the grander scheme of things, even though it's important to acknowledge it and to work through it, these larger systemic issues, we're really impacting people like that short perspective. Like very briefly, we have these brief encounters from our perspectives in our roles, but these encounters are impactful and they do matter. And I think reminding yourself that even when you don't feel like they do, right? Reminding yourself of when they did, and when you were able to maybe intervene for better outcomes for one family, and the ripple effect of maybe that one family that you were able to intervene with. So I think I would say that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was so inspiring and wonderful. Dr. Reed, we are, coming to the end of our time. I just wanted to give you a little space in case you wanted to make any like announcements or shout outs in regards to any work or resources that you might think are important for our viewers.
Resources. I think more nationally, we have like the Innocence Project, people that are involved in the work. In Illinois, there's the Illinois Justice Commission, I would shout out, that are working to hold the state to the acts, right? That the Illinois Justice Act and being able to understand your current laws, I think, are really important. So there are amazing resources, and understanding your rights as well is really important. So I would point to that. No real announcements, but I appreciate so much the ability to have this dialogue and to meet you and the work that you're doing. I think you're providing so much needed education, and that is so helpful. And I think it also makes it accessible, right? What we're talking about, accessible for others navigating this process. And so thank you for the work that you're doing.
Thank you so much for coming onto the show. We're very grateful.